My name is Helen Matthews. I'm a widow, 67 years old, and I've worked with numbers my entire life. I've always known exactly where every penny was. I raised my son on my own, paid for his college, helped with the down payment on his first house, watched his kids when he went through a divorce, and I was always there whenever he called. But he wasn't there for me. For 5 years in a row, he forgot my birthday. No card, no call, not even a casual hello. Each time I forgave him, and then I simply stopped reminding him. But you see, while he was busy forgetting me, I made sure to remember something important. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. The day I turned 67 was an ordinary Thursday, just like any other. The sky was overcast, not enough for rain, but the sun never showed. Morning light slid across the floor in a muted gray, casting long shadows from the kitchen chairs. I stood by the counter, slowly pouring hot water over a tea bag, and kept telling myself not to look at the phone. I had made the same promise last year, and the year before, but promises made to yourself don't always hold up under silence. I glanced at the phone anyway. Nothing. No text, no missed call. Just the default background, a blue sky over a field of yellow grass. Some generic wallpaper I'd never changed. I stared at it longer than I should have, then placed it face down on the table and sat in front of it like I was waiting for a verdict. 5 years in a row without so much as a happy birthday from my only child. I didn't cry, I didn't sigh, I didn't even feel anger anymore. The absence had settled too deep for that. It had grown roots in places I no longer tried to pull clean. I simply stood, went to the fridge, pulled out the small apple pie I had baked the night before, and placed it in the oven to warm. It was my favorite, cinnamon heavy, not too sweet, with a crumble top. I'd made it the same way for decades, the kind of recipe that lived in my hands rather than on paper. I always baked it on my birthday, even when I'd had people to share it with. Harold used to sneak a slice before it had fully cooled, said it was best when it burned your tongue just a little. I sliced a piece for myself and sat in the breakfast nook, looking out the window at the backyard. The lawn had gone a bit long. I made a mental note to mow it this weekend. Maybe trim back the rose bushes. There was a time when Michael used to do that for me. When he would show up with his sleeves rolled, his hands already stained from the oil of the mower. He used to bring his boys, and they would sit on the porch eating popsicles while he worked. Those days were gone. I took a bite of pie and let the flavor settle on my tongue. Sweet, warm, familiar. It was my birthday after all. And even if no one else celebrated it, I would. I walked through the house afterward, slowly, room by room. I had lived in this house for 30 years, raised my son here, buried my husband from here. It was the only place that still felt like mine in a world that had grown increasingly impersonal. But even within these walls, some rooms had gone quiet. Some pictures had come down, others had never gone up. I passed by the guest room, once Michael's, now mostly used for storage. I opened the door, not intending to, but drawn by some impulse I didn't question. The bed was neatly made, the closet still holding some of his old jackets, a few boxes of forgotten items from his first marriage. I closed the door softly and continued down the hallway. The living room still held the same furniture, the same bookshelf, the same sunspot on the rug where I used to find the cat curled in the afternoons. I turned on the radio, not the TV. I didn't want noise, just a little background music. Jazz, low and mellow. It made the house feel less empty. At noon, I checked the phone again. Still nothing. I went outside and watered the plants. The geraniums by the front step were starting to bloom, little bursts of red against their dark green leaves. I dead-headed the ones that had started to fade, shook out the mat by the door, and made a mental list of groceries I didn't need but would pick up anyway just for the sake of movement. By evening, the sky had cleared. A little. Just enough to let in a patch of golden light that painted the kitchen in amber hues. I set the table, not because I expected anyone, but because it felt better than eating at the counter. I made myself a small dinner, grilled salmon, green beans, wild rice, and poured a glass of white wine. Before I sat down, I picked up the phone one more time. Checked the call log. Still nothing. I sat at the table and raised the glass. Not in a toast, not even in mock ceremony, just a gesture, a moment for myself. "Happy birthday, Helen," I whispered. No one answered, but I smiled anyway, because if I waited for someone else to remember me, I'd wither. And I wasn't finished blooming yet. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of those perfectly mild spring days that made you feel guilty for staying indoors. I had spent most of the morning on the back porch, pruning the potted herbs and sipping iced tea, enjoying the rare warmth on my skin, the kind of day that whispered nothing bad could possibly happen. So when the phone rang and I saw Michael's name flash on the screen, I felt a brief flicker of hope. Maybe he had remembered. Maybe he was calling to apologize for forgetting again. Maybe this time would be different. I answered with a soft hello, trying not to sound too eager. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention my birthday. He dove right in, his voice too casual to be casual, like someone easing into a pool knowing the water's cold. He said, "Mom, we've been thinking." I knew that tone. It was the preamble to something framed as a favor, but weighted like a decision already made. He said they'd been talking. He and Alyssa, his wife, and they felt it might be time to make a change. He said it carefully, with that soft, polite confidence people use when they want you to believe a selfish act is somehow generous. He talked about how the house was getting to be too much for me, how the stairs weren't ideal, how I shouldn't have to worry about the yard, the maintenance, the stuff that comes with home ownership at my age. He said it would make more sense if I moved into a nice apartment or a senior condo, somewhere with amenities, somewhere easier. He made it sound like a gift. I listened. I didn't interrupt. He went on to say that the boys could use the extra room, that they were outgrowing their place, and that being in a bigger house, especially one already in the family, would be more logical than shopping for something in this market. He said they'd make updates, paint the walls, redo the floors, give the house new life. I wondered if he even realized what he was saying, that my life, my presence, my history was now considered old and in the way. He framed it all as kindness, as pragmatism, as family helping family, but nowhere in his voice did I hear love. Not real love, not the kind that remembers a birthday or calls just to say hello. This was logistics, optimization, downsizing me to make space for himself. He said they could help me look at places, that they could even help me pack. He didn't ask if I wanted to leave. He didn't ask what the house meant to me. He didn't ask if I was okay. I stayed silent for a few moments after he finished. I could hear Alyssa in the background, her voice muffled but unmistakably present. She was there, orchestrating, shaping the offer. I imagined her pacing, giving Michael nods or hand gestures of encouragement as he pitched the plan. He asked what I thought. I said I appreciated the concern. I told him I'd think about it. It was the safest answer, the one that bought me time, the one that didn't show how my chest had hollowed out with something between hurt and fury. After we hung up, I sat in the living room without turning on the lights. The afternoon sun painted long stripes across the carpet. Everything in the room was still, the books on the shelf, the vase on the table, the old Afghan draped over the arm of the couch. I looked around and saw not just furniture, but years. Memories layered into fabric and wood and chipped ceramic. I saw Harold's chair, now unused. I saw the fireplace mantel, where Michael's graduation photos still stood, and I saw him as a boy again, clear as if he had walked through the doorway, his sneakers scuffing the tile as he ran in from school, holding up a crumpled drawing of our house with crooked windows and too many birds in the sky. How proud he had been to show it to me. The way he'd crawl into bed on stormy nights, whispering, "I'm not scared, just cold," and press his small hands to my chest. I remembered him refusing to leave for kindergarten until I tied his shoes exactly the way he liked, double-looped, bunny ears every time. I remembered baking cupcakes for his 7th birthday, each topped with a tiny plastic dinosaur, and how he cried when the green one got squished. I remembered the night he broke his arm falling off his bike, and how he clung to me in the emergency room, trusting without question that I'd make the pain go away. He had once believed I could fix anything. Now he believed I was in the way. Later, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the front steps, watching the breeze stir the tulips. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the long nights working overtime when Michael was in college, the summers I had given up vacations so I could help with his down payments, his children, his recovery after the divorce. I thought about how often he had said, "Thank you," how often he had asked what I needed in return. The answer was not often, almost never. And now he was asking for my home, asking with a smile, with soft words and gentle tones and a rehearsed sense of reason. But asking nonetheless. He had forgotten my birthday. Again. And now he was asking me to forget myself. Again. But I wasn't going to, not this time. After Michael's call, I didn't sleep well. Not that I expected to. His words had burrowed under my skin, not as daggers, but as something dull and persistent, an ache you only notice when you try to sit still. I found myself pacing the house that night, walking slowly through each room with bare feet on cool hardwood, touching surfaces as if they might disappear. Around midnight, I opened the hall closet, the one with the plastic bins and the dusty wrapping paper rolls, the one that held tax returns from before he was born, faded warranties, and the history of my life in crinkled manila folders. I reached for the black accordion file I kept tucked all the way in the back, beneath the blankets, behind the unused board games. My fingers found the edge of the plastic, and I pulled it out like I was lifting something sacred. I set it on the dining table, turned on the overhead light, and opened it. The documents were exactly where they were supposed to be, organized, labeled, proof that I had not only lived, but worked, built, saved. My entire adult life cataloged in numbered tabs and paperclips. I was always good with paperwork. I didn't trust memory as much as I trusted ink. There it was, the deed to the house. My name. Just my name. When Michael was going through his financial troubles, bad credit, divorce, mounting debt, I had agreed to co-sign for the house. He couldn't secure the loan alone. He had begged, said it was temporary, said it was just a formality. I hadn't hesitated. Of course I helped him. I was his mother, and when the lender recommended the title be placed in my name for simplicity, I didn't question it. I just signed. Now, a decade later, that signature was my anchor. I held the document in my hands for a long time. It was printed on thick paper, the legal kind that made a sound when you flicked it with your nail. My name, Helen Matthews, typed in bold black letters, property owner. No liens, no co-owners, just me. He had forgotten that. Or maybe he assumed I had. As I sat with the file, I found myself drifting back to when Harold was still alive. The house had felt warmer then, not just because of his laughter or the smell of his coffee every morning, but because it was a place we shaped together. I remembered the way he used to hum while fixing the sink, how his hands were always a little rough, how he insisted on planting roses along the fence even though neither of us had a green thumb. I remembered lying in bed next to him, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, talking late into the night about our plans, about Michael, about growing old in this very place. He loved this house. He loved the creak in the third stair and the window in the kitchen that always stuck in the summer. We fought here, laughed here, grieved here. It was the place where we danced slow in our socks to no music at all. I remembered how he stood next to me the day we first got the keys, handing me a bottle of cheap champagne and toasting to forever. I remembered the Thanksgiving when the oven broke and he improvised the entire meal on the grill in the backyard just to make sure Michael's first college break home still felt like home. Harold would have known exactly what to say to Michael now. He wouldn't have raised his voice. He wouldn't have lectured. He would have just looked him in the eye and reminded him who built this place, who kept it whole, who was still here. But Harold was gone, and I was the only one left to do the remembering. In the years that followed the purchase, I'd paid property taxes, maintenance, replaced the roof, painted the siding. Not because I expected thanks, but because I wanted to protect what I had helped build, what I believed would one day be his, if he earned it with respect. But respect had a funny way of disappearing when people thought something already belonged to them. I opened another file, the one marked Estate Planning. Inside were drafts of an old will, created when Harold was still alive. It hadn't been updated in years. At the time, the house was part of a plan, a future gift, a piece of legacy. But a lot had changed since then. Now I saw it not as legacy, but leverage. The next morning, I called my attorney. Her name was Diane Caldwell, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had helped me once before during the settlement of Harold's estate. I trusted her. I explained the situation plainly, without emotion. She listened. She didn't gasp. She didn't say, "Oh, honey," she said, "let's protect your assets." We scheduled a meeting for the following week. In the meantime, I made copies of everything. The deed, the mortgage statement, the insurance documents. I scanned them, emailed them to myself, and saved them in 3 different places. One in the cloud, one on a USB drive, and one in an envelope I labeled "In Case of Nonsense," which I tucked in the drawer of my nightstand. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. Not anymore. I was focused. This was no longer about a birthday or a phone call, or even about a son forgetting the woman who raised him. This was about space, my dignity. And now I had the paper to prove it. The rest would come in time. But this, the certainty, the proof, the quiet power of ink, was mine now, and I would not be giving it up. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon without warning. I had been out in the garden all morning, pulling weeds and turning the soil with my hands, feeling the warm dampness work its way under my fingernails. There was something grounding about that kind of labor, honest, repetitive, quiet. I was rinsing off the tools at the side of the house when I heard the car pull into the driveway. It wasn't a surprise, not really. I had felt it coming since the phone call. Michael stepped out of the driver's side, dressed neatly but casually. His presentation outfit, khakis, polo shirt, sleeves rolled up just enough to look relaxed, but intentional. Alyssa was with him, wearing oversized sunglasses and a tense smile. She carried a manila folder under her arm. That folder told me everything before a single word was spoken. They greeted me with light, practiced voices. Alyssa complimented the garden, said the tulips were lovely this year. I nodded, wiped my hands on my pants, and told them to come in. I offered water. They declined. We sat in the living room. They took the couch. I stayed in my chair. Michael began with a sigh, like this was going to be hard for him, like what he was about to say was brave or difficult or undeserved. He said they had been thinking again, talking about the future, the family, the kids, the finances. He used all the right words, responsible words, grown-up words. Then Alyssa opened the folder. Inside were documents. Not legal documents, at least not yet. Printouts, spreadsheets, market values, projections. There was even a mock-up of the house painted in a more modern color. They had done their research. They had a plan. He explained it slowly, carefully. The house, he said, had appreciated in value. It was a smart time to sell. The equity could go toward a new place for me, something smaller, more manageable, maybe in a retirement community with on-site health care. He used the phrase aging in place like it was a gift. They had found a few listings already, just ideas, condos, senior living villas, quiet, safe, low maintenance. I listened. He said they could help with the logistics, of course, packing, moving, sorting through the garage. Alyssa added that they'd be willing to handle the sale. They had a friend in real estate who could move the house quickly, discreetly. And, she added, they'd make sure I got a fair share. That's when I knew. They weren't offering me anything. They were offering to manage the extraction of what they believed already belonged to them. They said it was time to transition. They said it was the right move. They said it would benefit everyone. I sat back in my chair and let the words pass over me like a warm fog. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even blink. I just asked one question. What makes you think the house is yours to sell? They faltered. Michael blinked. Alyssa's mouth opened, then closed. He said something about family property, about understanding, about how we'd always said the house would be his one day. He talked about sacrifice, about shared investment. He mentioned how much time they'd spent here helping me, visiting, fixing the porch light that one time, bringing dinner every few weeks. I let him finish. Then I stood up, walked to the hallway, and returned with a single sheet of paper. The deed. I placed it on the table in front of them, pointed to the line with my name. Just my name. Their silence stretched, the same way silence stretches in courtrooms and hospital rooms, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled because its meaning is already heavy enough. Michael stared at it. Alyssa went pale. I told them calmly that the house had always been mine, that it had been in my name from day one, that their assumptions had never changed that fact. I told them I appreciated their concern, but I had no intention of moving, no intention of selling, no intention of leaving. They sat there for a few seconds longer. Then Alyssa closed the folder, her movements stiffer now, angrier. They said they needed time to process. I said I understood. They left without another word. After they drove off, I returned to the garden. The sun had shifted, and the soil was beginning to dry. I knelt down, placed my hands in the earth, and felt the roots beneath my fingers. Still strong, still mine. It took them 3 days to come back. 3 days of silence after I laid the truth on the table. I had expected an argument that same night, or maybe a flurry of texts, or some backpedaling in the form of apologies or explanations. But there was nothing, just a vacuum where their confidence had been. Then, on Wednesday afternoon, they showed up again. I saw the car from the window. I didn't move. I didn't rush to greet them. I just waited. The knock came, 3 sharp raps, and I answered with the calm I'd been practicing. They stepped inside like the house had betrayed them, like the walls themselves had switched sides. Michael's face was tight, his jaw clenched. Alyssa's sunglasses stayed on. Her arms were crossed over her chest like armor. Michael began to speak, and it wasn't the voice from before. It wasn't measured or soft. It had a new edge, cold, controlled, but only barely. He said he couldn't believe I was doing this, that after everything they'd done for me, after the holidays, after bringing the kids by, after making sure I never spent a birthday alone, I would pull this. He used the word pull like I had staged a performance instead of telling the truth. He said he felt blindsided. I asked how he could feel blindsided by a fact that had always been true. Alyssa cut in then, her voice sharp. She said it wasn't fair, that I had taken advantage of a bad situation, that Michael had trusted me with the paperwork when he was vulnerable, and that now I was using it against them. She called it manipulation. I let her finish. I asked if either of them had ever paid the property tax. They hadn't. I asked if either had ever paid the insurance, or covered the roof repair, or replaced the furnace last winter. They hadn't. I asked if they remembered why we had put the house in my name to begin with. That's when Michael snapped. He shouted, not just raised his voice, shouted, loud, raw, like the dam had broken. He said he was sick of being treated like a child, sick of being reminded of his mistakes, sick of me holding everything over his head like some kind of punishment. He said I always made him feel small. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "You've always needed to control everything, even this house, even me." He threw the word control like a rock through glass. It hit something in me I hadn't touched in years, something old and tired and bruised. I didn't yell back. I didn't cry. I simply told him that I wasn't trying to control anything. I was just no longer willing to be erased. The room went quiet. Alyssa looked away. Michael stared at me, breathing hard, as if he'd expected a different response. Maybe anger, maybe submission. I gave him neither. He turned and walked out. Alyssa followed. The door closed behind them, hard, but not slammed. The silence afterward was thicker than usual. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the clearing before it. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the table. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, not from sadness, but from the weight of standing up. The kind of trembling that comes after a storm has passed over your roof and left it standing. I looked around at the space I had built, preserved, loved. The house hadn't changed, but something in me had, and I wasn't going back. After the outburst, everything went still. The house returned to its normal rhythm almost too easily, like a song resuming after a sudden crack of thunder. But it wasn't the same, not really. The silence felt different, sharper, more deliberate, like a silence chosen rather than imposed. There were no more visits, no texts, no emails, no calls, not even accidental ones. For the first few days, I kept glancing at my phone, not because I was waiting, at least not consciously, but because that's what habit does. It tricks you into hoping. But by the end of the week, the screen remained dark and silent. I started rising earlier than usual, long before the sun was up. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my coffee and stare at the slow brightening of the sky outside the window, the way it turned from charcoal to lavender to soft blue. I'd listen to the creaks in the floorboards, the distant hum of the neighbors' sprinklers, the occasional rustle of leaves as birds returned to their branches. Everything in the house was quiet but alive, breathing. I filled my days with motion, not out of panic, but purpose. I cleaned the pantry, alphabetized the spices, went through old files, shredding paperwork that no longer needed keeping. I tackled the garage, dragging boxes out into the sunlight and deciding what could stay, what could go, and what needed to be dusted off and brought back into the house. I found photo albums I hadn't opened in years, snapshots of my wedding, Michael's first steps, camping trips in the Smokies, a birthday party where Harold wore a ridiculous hat and danced like he was still 25. I didn't cry when I looked at those photos. I smiled, sometimes laughed. The images didn't feel like ghosts. They felt like anchors. On Wednesday, I drove to the farmer's market and bought tulips, pink and white. I arranged them in the tall blue vase that used to sit in the living room before Michael said it clashed with the new rug. That vase had ended up in the garage with the rest of the dated decor. I brought it back inside, cleaned it, and gave it its old place on the mantel. It looked right there, like it had been holding its breath, waiting to come home. I started cooking again, really cooking, not just throwing things together to eat in silence. I made my favorite soups, roasted vegetables, baked cornbread in the cast iron skillet my mother passed down to me. I sat at the table for every meal, cloth napkin in my lap, music playing softly in the background. I lit candles some evenings, not out of loneliness, but ritual, a gesture of care for myself, something I had forgotten was allowed. One morning, my neighbor Claire stopped by with a basket of lemons from her tree and a small note that read, "For the brightest porch on the block." We sat in the sunroom for an hour, drinking tea and talking about nothing urgent, just spring dresses, a new bakery that opened on Main Street, and her latest obsession with crossword puzzles. It felt easy, light, like friendship should. That weekend, my old friend Louise came into town. We hadn't seen each other in nearly 2 years. She brought a bottle of red wine and a pie she claimed was almost homemade. We spent the afternoon on the back patio, under the shade of the elm, reminiscing about road trips we took in our 30s, laughing about Harold's terrible barbecue skills, and marveling at how fast time moved when no one was paying attention. She stayed until the porch lights flickered on, and when she left, she squeezed my hand and said, "You seem more like you again." The pause brought clarity. Without their voices in the background, without their expectations hanging over my shoulders, I could finally hear my own. It wasn't angry, it wasn't bitter, it was calm, confident. It asked questions I hadn't let myself ask in years. What do I want? What kind of mother do I want to be now? What kind of life do I still get to shape? I went for walks around the neighborhood, took different routes each day, stopped to talk to neighbors I hadn't seen in months. One woman, Sarah, invited me to a local book club. I accepted. Another neighbor, Mrs. Ellis, asked if I would help with the community garden this spring. I said yes. These invitations felt small, ordinary, but they stitched a sense of belonging back into my days. I didn't speak of Michael, not because I was avoiding the subject, but because there was nothing to say yet. The wound was not fresh, but it was healing, and sometimes healing sounds like nothing at all. One evening, I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine and watched the stars emerge one by one. The breeze was light, just cool enough to make me wrap my shawl a little tighter. I looked up at the sky and thought how strange it was that the quiet I once feared now felt like safety. There was peace in the stillness, in the knowing, in the owning. I had always been the giver, the one who fixed, helped, supported, the one who made space. Now I was learning what it meant to make space for myself, and I was in no hurry. It was a Thursday morning when he showed up. I had just finished folding the laundry and was bringing the basket back upstairs when I heard the knock at the door. It wasn't urgent, not loud or sharp, just 3 soft, uncertain taps. I paused at the top of the stairs, my hand resting on the banister, and waited a moment, unsure if I had imagined it. Then the knock came again. I walked to the front door slowly, heart quiet but alert. When I opened it, Michael stood there alone, holding nothing but his keys in one hand, his shoulders hunched slightly inward like a boy sent home from school. He wasn't wearing the practiced smile this time. His face was bare, tired. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, or maybe I was finally looking without filters. He asked if he could come in. I stepped aside and let him. He didn't go far, just inside the foyer. He stood there like someone unsure of the floor beneath him, as if every movement might trigger something. I didn't offer him coffee. I didn't ask him to sit. I waited. Then softly, so softly I almost didn't hear it, he said, "I'm sorry." He didn't look at me when he said it. His eyes stayed fixed on the hardwood floor, on the spot where the rug once lay before I had it removed and cleaned. He said it again, a little louder. Just those 2 words, not an explanation, not a justification, just an offering. I didn't answer at first. I watched him, watched how his hands fidgeted with his keys, how his breath was uneven, how the weight of the past few weeks seemed to rest in the slope of his shoulders. For a second, he looked like the boy who used to come home from school, drop his backpack by the door, and sit silently at the table when he knew he had done something wrong. He finally looked up. His eyes were red around the edges. Not tears, not yet, but close. He said he didn't know how things got this far. He said he hadn't realized how much I had been carrying all these years, that he'd let things pile up, expectations, assumptions, and never stopped to ask what I needed. He said he hadn't meant to hurt me, that when he brought up the house, it was never supposed to feel like an eviction. He said they were trying to do the right thing, but he admitted that maybe they had confused right with easy. I listened. I didn't nod. I didn't interrupt. I let the words settle in the space between us like leaves falling one by one. He struggled through each sentence, not because they were hard to say, but because he finally understood they mattered. Then he said, "You've always been there for me, and I never really asked how to be there for you." That's when my throat tightened, not because I needed the apology. Truthfully, I had stopped needing it weeks ago, but because there was honesty in his voice I hadn't heard in years. Real, unvarnished vulnerability. I took a slow breath and motioned for him to sit in the living room. He nodded and followed, sitting on the edge of the couch like he wasn't sure he was allowed to get comfortable. I sat across from him and, for the first time in a long while, let my voice carry the softness it once held when he was young. I told him about the time he climbed onto the roof of the garage when he was 6 and refused to come down until I promised he could have peanut butter and jelly for dinner. How he used to sneak popsicles from the freezer and hide the wrappers under the sofa cushions, thinking I'd never find them. How, when he was 8, he wrote me a note that said, "You are the best mom in the whole wide world," folded it into a paper airplane, and threw it at me during breakfast. He laughed at that genuinely. The sound cracked something open between us. I reminded him of the night he got lost in the grocery store and how I found him sitting in the detergent aisle, hugging a bottle of fabric softener and trying to look brave, of how he used to make up songs while brushing his teeth and insisted we call them tooth tunes. He smiled, eyes glassy. "You were wild," I said, "and beautiful, and mine." The room held that moment gently, like a glass bowl holding sunlight. He said nothing, just nodded slowly, the memories pressing into him as deeply as they lived in me. I told him I wasn't angry anymore. I told him I had needed space, and I had taken it. That the silence had been hard, but it had given me clarity. That I didn't expect him to change overnight. I only expected him to see me again, not as the woman who always made things work, but as a person with her own edges, her own needs, her own story. He asked if I would forgive him. I said yes, but I also said forgiveness wasn't permission to forget. That was the difference now. We sat in the quiet for a while longer. No hugs, no tears, just the soft tension of reconciliation trying to grow roots. He said he wanted to try again, that he'd talked to Alyssa, that things needed to shift, not just with the house, but with how they moved in the world around me. He said he wanted the boys to know me better, that he wanted to know me better. I told him that was a good place to start. He left quietly with a promise to return, not with plans, not with ideas, but with time. After the door closed behind him, I stood for a long moment in the same spot, letting the quiet return around me. It didn't feel hollow this time. It felt open. Apologies don't fix what was broken, but sometimes they let light in through the cracks. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something shift. Not back to what we were, but towards something new. The house felt different in the weeks that followed. Not because the furniture changed or the walls were repainted or the silence disappeared, but because the air inside it began to soften. It no longer carried the weight of unspoken words, of withheld recognition. It breathed easier. And so did I. Michael kept his promise. He didn't arrive with grand gestures or elaborate apologies, but he showed up. Once a week at first, then more often, sometimes just to bring coffee and sit with me on the back porch, sometimes with the boys, who wandered the house like it was a place they were learning to see with new eyes. I watched them explore corners they used to ignore, ask about photos they had never noticed. I watched them look at me, not just as grandma, but as someone who had a life that extended beyond their own needs. One afternoon, Michael came with a framed photo. It was one of the few I hadn't seen in years. A snapshot from his high school graduation, the two of us smiling under a clear June sky, his arms slung around my shoulders, my hair a little darker then. He said he'd found it in an old box, thought I should have it. I placed it on the mantel, next to the blue vase and a candle that smelled like rosemary and cedar. I updated my will. I met with Diane again, sat across from her in the same office where we'd once drawn lines for protection. This time we wrote from a place of clarity, not defense. I outlined everything with clean precision. The house, my assets, my wishes. Not because I expected conflict, but because I had earned the right to choose what happened to what I had built. My name remained on the deed, unmoved, uncontested. I ordered new stationery, something simple, elegant. Cream paper, soft texture, embossed at the top with my name, and beneath it, in smaller print, Helen Matthews, Cedar Ridge Lane, Charlottesville, Virginia. My address, my name, my home. It felt good to see it that way. Not as a label, not as a location, but as a statement of being. I began planting again. Early spring gave way to full bloom, and I dug into the soil with a different kind of purpose, not to fill time, but to claim it. I lined the front walk with daffodils, added climbing jasmine to the porch rail. I hung a new wind chime just outside the kitchen window. Its gentle tones drifted in with the breeze and sounded like laughter, soft and unexpected. Neighbors noticed. They waved more. A few stopped to ask about the garden, about the chime, about how I managed to keep the hydrangeas so vibrant. I told them the truth, that I listened more now, to the light, to the quiet, to what the house wanted to become. And something else changed too, something more unexpected. A door I hadn't realized was still open began to creak wide again. His name was Paul Henderson. We had known each other for decades, back when Harold and I used to attend summer community concerts. Paul had been widowed for a few years, a kind man with kind eyes and a gentle voice that always sounded like it belonged on the radio. We ran into each other at the farmer's market. He was buying peaches. I was buying tulips. We started with coffee, then dinners, walks through the arboretum, a day trip to the lake. He listened the way few people do, not waiting to respond, but waiting to understand. He didn't try to fix anything. He just sat with me, his presence quiet and steady. He began leaving notes in my mailbox, handwritten, folded in half, sometimes a poem, sometimes just a line from a song we'd heard together. My favorites were the ones that said simply, "I saw this and thought of you." Eventually, I invited him over. He admired the wind chime. He helped mend the garden fence. He brought wine that actually paired well with the roast chicken I had prepared. We sat on the porch late into the evening, and I realized I wasn't filling silence. I was sharing it. We talked about the future one night under the stars, the kind of conversation you don't expect to have at this age, not after so much life has already passed. He asked what I thought about growing old together. I said I'd already started. We laughed, but we also didn't dismiss it. It was too early for announcements, too early for plans, but not too early for hope. I hosted a small dinner, just 4 chairs, a roast chicken, roasted carrots with thyme, a bottle of wine I had been saving. Michael and the boys came. Alyssa sent dessert, lemon bars, homemade, with a handwritten note that said simply, "Thank you for being patient." We ate outside under the string lights I'd strung across the patio. The boys laughed. Michael offered to fix the back gate that had been squeaking. I said I'd like that. I didn't say more. I didn't need to. That night, after everyone left and the house returned to stillness, Paul stayed behind. We sat on the porch with a blanket around our shoulders and stared up at the sky. It was one of those clear evenings where the stars look almost reachable, where the darkness doesn't feel like a closing, but a vast, open promise. The wind chime sang once, soft and certain. I looked around and saw everything in its place. The chair, the garden, the light still glowing in the kitchen. And I whispered, not for anyone else to hear, but because the words felt real and final. This is my home. This is my address. And for the first time in a long, long while, this is my life. And maybe, just maybe, my second chance at love, too.